Hey guys, Ken here. The 5D Mark IV was the last camera out of Canon's 5D line of DSLRs, and for a camera that came out in 2016, it's actually aged very nicely in certain respects like photo quality and durability, but in others like video features, it was sort of outdated from the moment that it was released. Recently, there's been a growing interest in these older cameras because there's a lot of them out there on the used market, and I've seen a lot of these go for well under $1,000. Which is still a lot of money, but it's a huge bargain compared to the brand new mirrorless models. Plus, there's a very healthy market of pro-grade used EF mount lenses. So the question is the 5D Mark IV still a worthwhile camera to get in 2024? The short answer is, if you're looking for a pro-grade camera and you're not necessarily craving all of the crazy new features that the newer mirrorless models are offering, then yes. If you're looking for something that's spectacular and completely future-proof for video, I would look elsewhere, but the video question does get a little bit more complicated, and we'll get into that. So it definitely depends on your own personal needs, but I am going to go over all the strengths and weaknesses of this particular camera, some considerations considering what's on the mirrorless market these days, and exactly who this might be for. So this is a review of the Canon 5D Mark IV in 2024 from, someone who actually still uses it. So let's go over some quick specs and features for those unfamiliar with the 5D Mark IV. This is a 30.1 megapixel full-frame DSLR with a Digic 6 Plus processor. It is weather sealed to the wazoo and has a nice responsive touchscreen. It has dual card slots, one compact flash, and one SD. ISO range is from 100 to 32,000 natively, expandable up to 102,400. It has dual pixel autofocus for video and when shooting in live view for photos, and when shooting through the viewfinder you get 61 autofocus points. There is no in-body image stabilization. Shoots up to 7 frames per second in photo. For video it could shoot 4K up to 30 FPS, but the 4K is kind of crippled on this thing. I'll get into that. It does 1080p at 60 FPS, 120 FPS is possible at 720p, but you do lose autofocus. And certain copies will have C-Log. So weirdly, I was able to snag my used unit with the original box. The likelihood is that if you buy yours used, you may not get the original box, but that shouldn't matter a whole lot. By the way, this is kind of hilarious. I just realized recently that my 5D4 has C-Log installed. Bought mine a while ago. It does say with Canon log, but I couldn't find the setting in the menus for the longest time, so I just assumed that it just came with the wrong box. And the listing didn't really specify that it had Canon log. They usually make a big deal out of it. And since I bought this primarily as a photography camera, I just didn't really investigate further. I guess I just got lucky because the ones with log installed tend to be a little bit more expensive. If you're able to get one with the original box and all of its accessories, you should be getting a charger, a long USB cable for tethered shooting, and a camera strap. So let's get into the physical attributes of the camera, and if there's a weird shadow on my face, it's because I have a overhead rig right here with a tape measure for those who want to see the actual dimensions as I'm handling this thing. So let's start with the body itself. The viewfinder is nice and big, that full frame camera goodness. The rear screen is 3.2 inches and the image quality is actually really good. And if I may say, the touch screen is also nice and responsive. But as you can see, it's not an articulating screen, it is a fixed screen, so doing things like vlogging will be a bit challenging. I think they went with the fixed screen for durability, and speaking of durability, let's get into that. This thing is built like a tank. If I had to choose a camera for a critical photography assignment and for some reason I couldn't take a spare with me, I would choose either a 5D Mark IV or Canon 1DX Mark III. Canon cameras are kind of like the Toyotas of the camera world. It's really hard to kill them. Durability is absolutely top notch, especially when compared to a lot of the mirrorless models out there. Now, my personal 5D Mark IV has not necessarily been through the ringer, but there are countless stories out there of Canon cameras being hit by fireworks, being dropped from cliffs, and being submerged in rivers for prolonged periods of time, and still coming out perfectly operable. Now, because of the mirror inside of it, it is quite big, but it is relatively easy to handle. I actually love the ergonomics of this camera. All of the dials and buttons are very easy to reach, and as someone with relatively large hands, I appreciate that my pinky doesn't fall off the bottom of the grip. Those with smaller hands may have a harder time handling this camera. And the weight is actually not bad. The weight problems will arise with lenses. Full frame lenses, even the mirrorless ones, tends to be relatively heavy. Even then, the beefy grip does help quite a bit. And for those who want to see the dual card slots, it's here. Card number 1 is a compact flash card, and card number 2 is an SD card. I'll get into the card formats a little bit later. So the durability of this camera is a 5 out of 5. You can't get much better than this. Ergonomics, especially for when it came out, is like a 4.5 out of 5. Personally, I really like it, but when you consider the alternatives and what's available today, mirrorless models are becoming smaller, more compact, and lighter, so when made in comparison, it's like a 3 or a 3.5 out of 5, but only when made in comparison to the newer models. So let's get into more of the critical use aspects of this camera. Setup and ease of use is absolutely top-notch. Canon cameras are well known for being very user-friendly and easy to set up. However, keep in mind that because this is a professional DSLR, there are some more advanced features that have a bit of a learning curve, like the different focusing modes, C-Log, double exposure, which is super cool, and dual pixel RAW, which is very useless. All of the frequently used features are quickly accessible, and the menus are put together very intuitively. Now for critical quality, I'm going to break this down into two sections, for photography and for video, because I have pretty different opinions for each one. Feel free to skip ahead with the chapters to the information that you need. Alright, so there's a lot here, so I'm going to have my iPad with me. So the critical image quality for photography is excellent. The files come out beautifully and they're very easy to work with. 30 megapixels is a nice sweet spot in resolution. Personally, the most resolution that I would want in a camera is 45 megapixels. 95% of photographers don't need any more than that. Even 24 megapixels is enough for the vast majority of people. 30 is a nice sweet spot between super high resolution and still maintaining the flexibility of smaller file sizes. Dynamic range is something that people crucified this camera for. The reality is that it's actually okay. 13.6 stops of dynamic range is enough, and if you feel like it's a deal breaker, you should probably learn to expose properly. Low light quality is actually pretty good considering its age. Whenever I need a camera that could do relatively well in low light, I usually take this camera with me. Now I can't see in the dark like the newer cameras can, and the images are going to come out muddy and noisy when compared to like the newest Sonys and Canons, but how much low light ability do you actually really need? This is actually not as much of a problem as most people make it out to be. So image quality in good light gets like a 4.5 out of 5, even when you consider what's available today. In normal and good light, the images really just come down to the user. The color resolution, dynamic range, and low light quality are all excellent, more than acceptable. Now, if you only ever do low light photography, this may come down to a 3.5 or a 4 out of 5, but again, these are very specialized situations. Now, getting into more of the technical aspects of the camera, the autofocus is going to be alright when using the viewfinder. You have 61 autofocus points, but they're not really well distributed throughout the viewfinder. They're kind of clumped in the middle without much border coverage. Now that problem does go away in live view, but I really wish that they spread out the viewfinder AF points a bit better. However, the autofocus is going to be good enough for most people, including wedding photographers, and if you need something snappier and more accurate, switching over to live view allows you to use dual pixel autofocus. So here's a series of photos where my wife ran and zigzagged toward the camera on high-speed continuous shooting through the viewfinder, and here's another series using object tracking in live view. So autofocus through the viewfinder gets like a 3 or a 3.5 out of 5. When switching over to live view, it's more like a 4 out of 5. It was definitely not a class leader when it first came out, and considering how far AF technology has actually come, it's not the fastest and snappiest thing to use. However, in the hands of somebody that's adequately skilled, this is not as much of a problem as it seems. Now, one big weakness that was a big hang-up for this camera when it first came out was its continuous shooting speed. 7 frames per second, which is arguably not really fast enough for sports or wildlife, but it's enough for my own personal needs. Now, this does bring me to my next point, and it's the slow card slots and the weird card formats. Even with the relatively slow shooting speeds, you only get a few seconds of shooting before the buffer needs to clear. If you're shooting to both card slots, this only gets worse. And this is because it uses a relatively old compact flash format for its primary card and an SD card in a slow UHS 1 card slot for its secondary. Even when this first came out, compact flash was already a relatively old format, and faster UHS 2 card slots were becoming more and more the norm. So continuous shooting speeds and memory formats gets like a 2.5 or a 3 out of 5, especially when you consider its original MSRP and what was already available in the market at the time. That being said, my overall experience with this camera for photography has been excellent. I love all the files that come out of it, it's relatively easy to use, and it's just fun. Honestly, if I had to cover a wedding or an event with this, I would just need this, like 2 prime lenses and a couple of extra batteries, and I'll feel pretty confident. Here's another feature that I like. It's the silent mode for the shutter. Silent mode, it's not completely silent. Now I know that the mirror slap is kind of an obnoxious sound, especially in the age of mirrorless, but this was actually considered relatively quiet when it came out. So this is on normal mode, and in silent mode, much more quiet. So my only personal hang-up with this is for lightweight travel. This with a few full frame lenses becomes a very big kit very quickly. So unless I'm going on a trip that requires its durability and I'm able to take my camera case, I will usually opt for the Fuji X-T4 for its portability. Now all of that was for photography. Things change for video. So let's start with the good. The 1080p on this camera is some of the most beautiful 1080p around, especially when it first came out. It is solid, good to work with, and just looks good. You have IPB and all I formats. The only downside to 1080p is that it's limited in all codecs to 8-bit color. Now, the problems arise when you venture out of 1080p and good light. 4K looks great. The problem is that it uses a completely clunky motion JPEG format, which is massive and not as flexible as some more efficient formats. Not only that, when you're shooting in 4K, you get this massive 1.7 times crop on the image. So unless you want to use really wide lenses for normal shooting purposes and you have unlimited amounts of storage, 4K is basically never used by me, but your mileage may vary. Someone did comment on another video of mine saying that they used 4K on a 5D Mark IV for feature film, but hard drive storage is kind of precious to me, so it's basically just never used by me, ever. Personally, I believe this camera was rightfully criticized for its 4K format and its many limitations. Now, what about slow motion? Personally, I think that 60 frames per second is plenty, but for those of you who want 120 FPS, you need to go down to 720p in order to access it. Keep in mind, in 120 FPS, you do lose autofocus. Low light performance isn't bad, but it's definitely showing its age. Noise is acceptable to around 1600 ISO, and it gets really messy from there. So here's a couple of high ISO tests starting at ISO 100, ISO 200, ISO 400, ISO 800, ISO 1600, and this is about what it actually looked like in the room, ISO 3200, ISO 6400, and ISO 12800. Again, we have ISO 100, ISO 200, ISO 400, ISO 800, ISO 1600, ISO 3200, and this is about what it looked like in the room, ISO 6400, ISO 12800, and ISO 25600. And lastly, we have ISO 100, ISO 200, ISO 400, ISO 800, and ISO 1250. This is about what it looked like in the room, ISO 1600, ISO 3200, ISO 6400, ISO 12800, and ISO 25600. So this is a camera for good lighting only, but then again, low light performance is actually not as much of a problem as people make it out to be. Unless you only shoot in specialized situations where you're in low light environments and you can't add any of your own lighting, this is just fine. Personally, I rarely have to shoot above ISO 640 for any of my own video shots because I make sure to add and shape lighting, which is what you should be doing anyways if you're trying to up your filmmaking game instead of relying on your camera's low light ability. Just as a side note, I shoot all of my video on a crop sensor Fuji X-T4. Still, 1080p looks great outside of these limitations, and honestly, some people just don't care about 4K. If you only need 1080p for your own applications, then this is a great camera for video. Now, just for reference, this is what the 1080p image looks like coming out of the 5D Mark IV upscaled to 4K, but I can't see myself because there's no articulating screen, and I don't have the right HDMI cable to connect to my external monitor. Let's talk a little bit about C-Log. Canon used to have the option where you could send in your 5D Mark IV for them to install a log profile for about $99, which massively expands video dynamic range. However, I actually haven't been able to find that option on their website, so they may have discontinued it. Some used models, like mine, may come with C-Log, which makes video much more usable. And C-Log on the 5D Mark IV is actually really nice. It retains a lot of the details in the shadows, which may otherwise get lost. So video image quality gets a 4.5 out of 5 for 1080p in good light, but a 3 out of 5 for almost any other situation. Video autofocus is smooth and reliable. In fact, compared to my much newer Fuji X-T4, video autofocus is many magnitudes more reliable. Face detection is quick, just not in comparison to the more modern Canons and Sonys out there. Dual pixel autofocus just looks natural and good. It's just good. So video autofocus gets like a 4 out of 5. Compared to the newer models, maybe a 3 out of 5. Now, if you can't tell, I really don't use this camera for video. Not because it's horrible, but mostly because I have a camera that's a little bit more versatile and usable when it comes to filmmaking. It's just not an excellent video camera or a hybrid camera. Especially for what's available on the used market, there's just better alternatives. If you are looking for a camera specifically for professional video, I would probably look elsewhere. I'm also considering the future-proofing of this type of purchase. This is kind of old technology. If you want to future-proof your system, this is just not it. Now, if this was the only camera that I had and I needed to build a YouTube channel, I'll make it work. The 1080p looks good enough, and in some cases, upscaling to 4K works just fine. I can also add an external monitor, which eliminates the need for a flippy screen. But if I didn't have a camera and I was in the market for one, I would probably skip this one for video, unless the features that I mentioned are good enough for your applications. Again, think forward about future-proofing your system. So, who is this camera for in 2024? There's a reason as to why this was and still is a favorite amongst wedding and portrait photographers. The photographer for my wife and I's wedding used a 5D Mark IV for some of the shots, and guess what? The photos are absolutely stunning. This is an absolute beast of a professional camera, especially in the hands of an artisan like our wedding photographer. If you can't make beautiful images with this, don't blame the camera. If you have a $5,000 camera and a 10-cent skill set, having a new camera isn't going to suddenly make your photos any better. This is also great for landscape photography. Seriously, anything beyond 24 megapixels is much bigger and has more resolution than most people realize. This will work just fine for 90% of landscape applications. If you need very high continuous shooting rates, then probably skip this camera, but if your shooting style doesn't really need that, it is still possible to do wildlife photography with this. Also, if you need something that's very compact, look elsewhere. So the Canon 5D Mark IV tends to be for three camps of people. Number one, you already have a lot of Canon EF lenses and you don't want to upgrade to mirrorless. Now before you dismiss moving up to the mirrorless cameras, keep in mind that adapting the EF lenses to the R series cameras have been very successful. Camp number two, you only care about photography and minimally about video unless all you need is 1080p. And camp number three, wedding and portrait photographers who don't need an overkill hybrid setup. This camera was almost made for wedding and portrait photographers. For that application, this is excellent and will continue to be excellent. For everyone else, if you just want a high quality, rugged camera for photography applications, this is great. If you want a semi-hybrid setup and only need 1080p, this is also great. So for the money that these are going for these days, I think that this is an excellent value, especially if you fall into one of those three camps of people that I described earlier. Now I'm going to admit something. Compared to the more modern mirrorless models, this thing is like a fossil. The Canon R5 is on a completely different planet when made in comparison. But those mirrorless models are also thousands of dollars more. It's kind of an unfair comparison because mirrorless cameras are just turning into computers that you stick a lens onto. Now, I'm not going to make too many comparisons because this is not a comparisons video, but the closest competitor in this segment is probably going to be the Nikon D850. From what I remember, the Nikon is arguably better for photos, but worse for video. The Nikon D850 gives you 45 megapixels and legendary photo quality. People still talk about that sensor to this day. The autofocus through the viewfinder is much better, but not so great in live view. The video specs are also much worse. You only get contrast detect autofocus, which is basically no good for video, and the video codecs are kind of garbage. In short, video was kind of an afterthought for the D850. So if the only thing that matters is photography, I would say consider the Nikon D850, but on the used market, they're still way more expensive than the 5D Mark IV. However, I think that most people will be happy with either the Nikon or the Canon. If you need something that's much more usable for video and has better live view autofocus, the Canon is still the better pick. If you need something that's much more compact, other full-frame models won't make much of a difference because full-frame lenses are still going to be pretty massive. If you need something that's much more lightweight, compact, and portable, I'm going to point you towards the Fujifilm X-T series. On the used market, X-T3s and X-T4s go for a pretty good bargain. So for the price that these are going for these days, you're getting an extremely durable professional camera with a beautiful 30 megapixel sensor, dual card slots, beautiful 1080p, and a bungled 4K format. If you need a professional grade camera for photography that could still take great 1080p video and you don't foresee the need for higher quality formats and 4K, and you don't want to upgrade to mirrorless, you will probably be pretty happy with this camera. Remember, this thing used to retail for thousands of dollars. Just because it came out in 2016 doesn't make the sensor any worse. In fact, a lot of hobbyists and professionals still use this camera to this day because it's reliable and it's good. I love using this camera for photography. I bounce back and forth between this and the Fuji X-T4. If I didn't have the X-T4 for video, I would definitely be using this. So I hope that this video was helpful in some way in helping you make an informed decision of what camera to get next. If you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe, and thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.